There's something unsettling about a perfectly still room. At first, the scientists thought it was just a glitch, a dropped packet in the monitoring system, a delay in the feed. But when they replayed the footage, something didn't line up. The timestamp on the high-speed camera showed 14:08:16.002, and then nothing. Not 003, not 004, just silence, as if time itself had taken a breath and forgotten to exhale. It happened in Geneva, deep beneath layers of concrete and shielding inside a private particle dynamics facility. They had been running routine calibration tests on a new subharmonic synchronizer, a device meant to track atomic drift down to trillionths of a second. But at the moment of initiation, something else occurred. One of the clocks, certified against the International Atomic Time Database, stopped. Not slowed, not skipped, stopped. Worse, a pen mid-fall on a desk was caught in the air like a puppet with its strings held tight. A mug of tea, freshly brewed, had steam frozen above it like fingers of glass. A researcher caught mid-step never touched the ground. That exact frame of surveillance, frozen, but without a malfunction. The equipment worked fine. It was the reality around it that had refused to move. They called it a temporal dead zone, the first in human history. Outside the anomaly, nothing seemed wrong. The hallway clocks ticked. The world spun. Cars outside the facility drove past without incident. But inside a 2.7-meter radius, time had stopped. And after 3.2 seconds of total temporal stasis, everything resumed as if nothing had happened. Except for the data. The logs were wrong, one physicist said. It's like trying to read a book that's missing 3 pages, but all the chapter numbers are still there. They checked radiation levels, magnetic fields, gravitational anomalies. Nothing was off, except time, or rather, its absence. The incident was quietly reported to European space operations as a matter of concern, fearing, perhaps, some side effect of satellite interaction or solar interference. But the agency dismissed it. Too localized, too contained. So the team tried again. A second test was scheduled exactly 1 week later. Same parameters. This time, they placed additional sensors and backup clocks from independent sources. GPS-synced optical lattice clocks, even mechanical ones. And again, at 14 hours, 8 minutes and 16 seconds, the phenomenon repeated. Every instrument inside the containment ring froze. But what troubled them most was the sound recording. There was none. Not silence in the way of quiet. Silence in the way of absence. A perfect vacuum. The kind of quiet that even the brain cannot contextualize. No room tone. No equipment hum. Not even the buzzing of electric wires. The kind of nothing that suggested something had been removed. Not just paused, but erased. The lead technician, Dr. Leon Kramer, began speaking to the anomaly as if it were alive. "Do you want something?" he whispered during the third test. The rest of the lab watched in uncomfortable silence. That test ran without issue. No freeze, no missing seconds, no stillness, just data. Some joked that it had heard him, but jokes stopped on the 4th attempt. Because when they ran the calibration again, the anomaly shifted. It didn't happen at 14 hours, 8 minutes, and 16 seconds. It happened earlier. And when it passed, the logs didn't just show a pause. They showed a discrepancy. Time had caught up. For the first time in recorded history, a clock ticked faster to realign. By the end of the test, all timing systems were ahead by 1.6 nanoseconds. Something had snapped back. It wasn't just that time had stopped. It was that it had resumed wrong. After this, the facility was locked down. External access was restricted. Word hadn't spread beyond internal physics circles, but the implications were severe. Time, assumed to be the one unbreakable constant, had flexed. and no one could explain why. Security footage was reviewed obsessively. One frame, right before the fourth anomaly, showed a strange artifact. Barely a blur, something like a ripple in the air. Not visual, not digital, physical, but immaterial. Like a heat wave in a shape that didn't move. The media, of course, never learned. The world continued. But in that basement room, beneath Geneva's foundations, the team of physicists sat in silence, staring at clocks that ticked and wondering what it meant when one day they might not. And worse, what if time stopped again and never started back up? 2 weeks after the fourth anomaly, the clocks ticked on as expected. The team resumed operations under the pretense of control, but there was no real comfort in the data. Every tick of the chronometers now felt like a question mark, fragile, conditional, as if time itself had been reduced from a law to a habit. Then came the hallway incident. A routine technician, Mira Halden, was tasked with inspecting the fiber optic links that ran the internal timing cascade. She walked the sublevel corridor between labs 4 and 5, a sterile stretch lit by blue sodium vapor tubes. Cold, humming, polished floors. It was supposed to be unremarkable, except her reflection didn't follow her. Not at first, not at once. She didn't notice until she stopped walking and saw her mirrored image in the wall's polished surface take 2 extra steps before freezing, then snapping into sync like a buffering stream. She dropped her tablet, backpedaled, and watched as her reflection moved before she did. The cameras in the hallway showed nothing wrong. Timecode stamped each frame with perfect fidelity. But when slowed to individual increments, frame 7631 showed her shadow facing the wrong direction. Not just lagging, but mirrored wrong, like a simulation rendering a guess. She never entered that hallway again. Psych evaluations followed, but Mira passed every test. No fatigue, no chemical imbalance, no history of hallucinations. And worse, she wasn't alone. 2 other staff reported similar events. One saw a mug fall off a counter and bounce upward into their hand. Another claimed the bathroom faucet poured water that reversed its stream for just 1 second, pooling upward into the tap. Whatever was happening, it wasn't isolated. And it wasn't just stillness anymore. It was reordering. Data streams across the facility began showing jitter. Subtle time dilations so small they could be mistaken for server hiccups. But these fluctuations matched no network activity. One graph looked eerily like a heartbeat. Peaks and troughs that didn't belong in timecode. A visitor from a European Temporal Research Council arrived for an inspection. She brought her own instruments, atomic pendulums, portable reference clocks, and a device called a chronodrift register. When she set it up in the original test chamber, the reading came back impossible. According to her device, time in that room was passing 0.000000012% slower than in the hallway outside. A difference so small it would take years to become noticeable. Unless you were measuring with the precision they were. The hallway had no reflection because it wasn't in the same now. This idea took hold of the lab like a fever. What if the anomalies weren't breaks in time, but fractures in sequence? A whiteboard filled with scribbles, causal echo, temporal bleed, recursive latency. None of them satisfied. The truth was worse than any theory, because during one of the team's sleep studies, designed to test if humans could detect the shifts unconsciously, a researcher recorded themselves sleep-talking. Only it wasn't speech. It was a sequence of numbers, long, monotonous, no repetitions. A machine learning specialist ran it through a compression algorithm and found that it mapped perfectly to the timecode gaps in the previous tests. They weren't random. They were being counted. That's when fear became reverence. Not only had time stopped, it had been aware of it. Outside interest grew. A silent memo was shared across high-level European labs marked EWS, Extra World Scenario. The file listed strange events going back a decade. A neutrino spike in Antarctica, a lunar orbiter shutting down for 6 seconds and rebooting with updated star charts. A comet's path shifting mid-trajectory, then correcting days later. Unrelated events, until they were viewed through the same lens. Something had been watching time, or worse, editing it. Dr. Kramer stopped speaking entirely. He came in each morning, ran his tests, reviewed the logs, and left. But he began writing. Not lab notes, something else. Pages filled with looped glyphs. Spiral-like structures drawn in ink that never smeared. No one could read them until one night, Mira walked by his office and saw him asleep. The pages were moving, not flipping, moving. Each inked spiral shifting slightly, like a living eye caught mid-blink. She looked at the wall clock. It had stopped, but her watch hadn't. And in that dissonance, 2 clocks disagreeing about now, she realized what no physicist had yet dared say. Time wasn't breaking, it was branching, and inside those branches, something was stirring. Atop a dry plateau in Chile, under the clearest sky Earth could offer, an array of mirrors stared into the cosmos, stitched together into a giant synthetic eye. But tonight, that eye wasn't looking outward. Not entirely. After Myra's anomaly circulated through classified channels, an experimental program was activated. It wasn't built to find exoplanets or measure light curves. It was built for something stranger. Temporal prediction through quantum echo. In theory, the machine could simulate the most probable configurations of the near future by observing entangled particles fired into Lagrange points, places of cosmic balance where gravity holds still. The signals weren't precise. They were more like ripples in a pond, after a stone had been dropped tomorrow, and the ripples had started changing. Instead of generating abstract noise or chaotic timelines, the observatory began producing patterns. Not images, not numbers, maps. Diagrams of planetary alignments that hadn't happened yet. Seismic activity forecasts that came true down to the hour. A coastal flood warning in Indonesia, 6 days before any satellite saw the storm forming. It wasn't predicting time. It was reading it, like a seismograph for causality. And then it stopped. Not from malfunction, but refusal. The instrument still functioned, but every output flatlined. No future, no signal, no next, as if time beyond a certain point had nothing to say. Mira flew in under an assumed name. She sat beneath the array, surrounded by wind and stars and wires, and stared at the one printout they hadn't shared publicly. A crude image. Flores. Black background. In the center, a narrow white shape, like a slit or a door. It was time-stamped. Next month. She looked up at the stars and whispered, "What are you waiting for?" The array, powered down but still warm, made a sound, like breath caught in a throat, like something about to begin or end. And in the dead silence of that plateau, time paused again. Time, it turned out, didn't have an edge. It had a slope, a quiet gradient, barely perceptible, that humanity had always slid down without question. But now, somewhere between Myra's frozen hospital room and the breathless silence of the observatory, something had changed. The slope had steepened, or vanished altogether. The final logs from the observatory contained no predictions. No celestial alignments, just a single phrase, generated by a model that was never programmed to speak. We are no longer observed. That same night, time anomalies rippled across Earth. Some clocks ran backward for less than a second. Others looped, restarting a minute twice. A man in Tokyo reported seeing himself exit a train station before he entered. In Iceland, A group of astronomers found their own research notes already printed before they typed them. But it wasn't chaos. It was something else. Recall, as if time, disturbed by being looked at too closely, had flinched. Governments buried the data. Satellites were quietly taken offline. The Lagrange sensors were dismantled and reclassified as failed experiments. But for those who had seen the white slit on the black printout, those who knew, life never returned to normal. Mira stopped tracking the future and began tracing the past. Not her own, but humanity's. Across ancient structures, cave carvings, and forgotten calendars, she found symbols, always in the margins, always consistent. A vertical line, a tier, a passage. In every civilization, one idea had endured. That time is not a river, but a corridor, and doors eventually open. The slit from the observatory printout began appearing elsewhere. Not on screens, but in dreams, in shadow patterns, reflected briefly in elevator mirrors or glass doors before blinking out of existence. Always narrow, always vertical, always watching. Then, on the equinox, the moon aligned directly over a region of gravitational anomaly in the Pacific. For 13 minutes, the rotation of the Earth slowed by an immeasurable but detectable fraction. The global atomic clock corrected it, then failed. 6 identical time reports were submitted from 6 continents at once, all ending with the same final second, then nothing. And yet, the world did not end. It simply decoupled. Traffic lights still turned green. Babies still cried. Markets still opened. But something had been severed. A tether between consciousness and chronology. People began to remember events that hadn't happened yet, or forget those that had. A woman recited a news headline before the event was even conceived. A child finished a sentence his father hadn't started. Reality didn't unravel. It drifted, and Mira, now older, found herself on a beach at dawn, holding a device with no power that still displayed a countdown. 1 second, then 0, then blank. Above her, the sky shimmered, not with stars, but with absence. A vertical slit, impossibly high, hung just long enough to be mistaken for a cloud, and then closed. She didn't scream, because this wasn't fear. It was arrival. Somewhere, in the spaces between seconds, the universe had shifted its weight, and time blinked.